unfortunately. I can remember being an undergraduate student at Tuskegee, and I always would say, like, why do I always have to join an organization to do this or to do that or to do this? And I was not exactly happy about it per se, because when you are in an organization, it's not just you have to negotiate terms, you have to deal with other people's personalities, you have to push lines and agendas, and you try to get people on the same page. That being said, if you can do that, the outcomes are more beneficial than if you just go outside and start doing what you're doing. Not to say that individuals don't impact change, but organizations impact the most change. And so that's some of what I want to focus on, because today we're looking at the resolutions from the first Pan-African Congress, and that was document sent to you all. And in looking at that, I wanted to see the kind of change that Congress was hoping to make. Very important historical piece. One, Henry Sylvester Williams writes Booker T. Washington. I was just about to see if I have a copy of the book around, and I don't have one on. Oh, wait, hold on. I do have a copy. Hold on. 1 second, folks. Okay. Yes, I just slipped under my desk for that. Your twins wanted to say, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Sometimes I am, when I can put myself together. And I had a long day yesterday, but I was up ready to go. So, and good morning to you all, Malicia and twins. I'm glad you all can meet me here. Evening from Ghana. Hello. Okay. So I'm glad you all got on here. I know it's a struggle, but that's why we have a video for. So, yes, I wanted to just go back to one thing, Henry Sylvester Williams' relationship with Booker T. Washington. And he initiates a relationship with him the way many people do in the context of what we read already, by writing. And he asked him to be a part of what they were planning, which was the first Pan-African Conference. And I wanted to read briefly his letter, if I can find it. All right. Looks like it's taking me a moment to find it. But let me just say this. So, he is writing. Oh, yeah, here we go, right here. So, okay, so it was with the same level of developing consciousness that Booker T. Washington engaged the world. Shortly before the turn of the 20th century, he was formally exposed to the philosophy of Pan-Africanism, much in the same way that the rest of the world, through the coining of the phrase by the Secretary of the African Association, Henry Sylvester Williams. On behalf of the African Association, Williams wrote to Booker T. Washington for the first time in September of 1898 to solicit his support in their efforts to organize for the benefit of African people. He extended membership to Washington while enlisting his assistance in promoting the organization in the US. He wrote, this is Henry Sylvester Williams speaking to Washington, I take it you are alive to the necessity of a general union amongst the children and descendants of Ham, as it would tend to create a respect for us, which he believed did not exist. Washington agreed and was eager to promote the organization. The objective of the African Association, as described by Henry Sylvester Williams, was to respond to the need for unity amongst African people in order to garner respect in the world. The organization would make representations in cases of oppression affecting our people wherever found. So Henry Sylvester Williams is the first one to solicit Washington and pull him into this planning for the first Pan-African Conference. This would be the first time that Africans organized globally to eradicate oppression and exploitation in this way. And that's a very important point. I think going forward, good afternoon from Sierra Leone. Hello, hello. It's a very important point to understand that we can all have a certain sentiment and idea in our heads, but it's another thing to express it concretely. And this is really with this Washington in Africa book, that's really what it is about. Saying, when did we have concrete examples of Pan-Africanism, someone doing something for the benefit of African people in an organized way, not just some esoteric way, but organized internationally and with a Pan-African ideological position, right? So in thought, you seek to eradicate oppression and exploitation of African people. In practice, you actually do that. And then it's measurable in the end. And that moves Pan-Africanism from some esoteric feeling, where we all identify with each other, to it being something more concrete in practice, not just a theory, just an idea, because there's a lot of people, I think, who may just be Pan-African in sentiment, right? We don't want to see bad things happening to African people around the world, okay? Then there's the rest of us who don't want to see anything happening or something negative and harmful or hurtful or destructive happening to African people and ready to move on it. Right? But those are two different. Sometimes they're one and the same, but very often those are just very two different trends, So we may talk about, hey, we support our brothers and sisters here or there. But then the question is how do you support them? Like Kwame Ture say, we love our people through action, right? So Pan-Africanism is loving our people through action, being able to couple that with action. So really briefly, and you all have these chapters, but it's only for you to go back from the Washington in Africa book, chapter 2, book 2, Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist, is where I'm getting this from. And sure, you should revisit that in terms of the organization and individual activities related to Pan-Africanism at the turn of the century 1900, right? When it constitutes itself for the first time. So let me just finish this up right here. The organization. So the objective of the African Association was described by Henry Sylvester Williams. So Henry Sylvester Williams, but here's his organization, right? And today we're talking about organization. The organization would make representation in cases of oppression affecting our people wherever found. During the latter part of 1898, the association began the planning of the first Pan-African Conference in order to advance their aims. In June 1899, Williams wrote Booker T. Washington from London regarding the conference and enclosed a circular requesting that Washington or a representative of his choice present a paper on lynching in the U.S. Washington accepted the invitation and promised to make it known widely as possible. He not only promoted the conference through the Black press, he outlined the agenda and deemed it a very important movement on the horizon. The organization The organization's desire to create a body that would foster unification amongst African people internationally was a much needed and progressive endeavor, according to Booker T. Washington, and therefore worthy of his support. Uh, so I'm going to leave it there, but the point of it is, hold on. Okay, I'm losing power. Hold on one second. Hold on one second, folks. I'm sorry.
All right.
All right. I was losing power, and I want to make sure we don't get interrupted. So the point of the African Association is to bring about this organization that will basically stage a conference in 1900, and there's many African people who will come together for the purpose of participating in London. So Africans from all over the world, and you can revisit chapter 2. Now, the first Pan-African conference in 1900, Washington would not attend, Du Bois would attend, many others, and it would be in London. That being said, the conference at 1900, and I think I have a list of the participants and some of the basic goings on at that particular conference. However, the conference in 1900 would be the last time they would all be together in that sense, meaning Du Bois would emerge as the sole survivor of the conference of 1900. And 19 years later, in 1919, he would execute what would become known as the First Pan-African Congress. Okay. Any student of this history should know the difference. And it's so funny because I see other scholars who should have some knowledge of Pan-Africanism, certainly, see themselves as knowledgeable, but make this very critical mistake. It's very two different things. The conference was just a conference in 1900. And don't get me wrong, it's not just any conference. I mean, it's like, once again, Kwame Ture says, is like every meeting is historical, right? So you never know if that meeting is going to go down in history. So every meeting is historical. That being said, it was a conference, a one-time event come to, as we look back. But Du Bois, and this is where Du Bois's greatest contribution, in my opinion, to the African world and to Pan-Africanism comes from, because he would be the person who remembers that this is some work that we must return to. He writes between that time a book called A World in Africa, which we also, I used as an undergraduate student. I read it first as an undergraduate student at Tuskegee, and then I would read it again in my orientation in a political organization. But Du Bois would not forget his responsibility to Africa, in spite of all his varied ideation and development, right? So 1900, you have the first Pan-African Conference. And that would be his great contribution. All the participants of the first Pan-African Congress, I hope I didn't say it wrong just now. All of the participants of the first Pan-African Conference are dead by 1919 at the at the time that the Pan-African Congresses, first of the Congresses, takes place. They're all dead. And so that's important to remember because Du Bois is the sole survivor. And with him comes the legacy of that first conference and remembering and the ideas that Pan-Africanism ultimately had to be expressed on the African continent. So the Congresses would largely be comprised of people who are representing Africa. Now, and of course, around the world, the African people scattered abroad. But as it moves forward, it becomes the setting, the Pan-African Congresses becomes the setting through which African leadership would express their vision and ideals and almost are facilitated in planning liberation. The most important of the 5 Pan-African Congresses would be the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. And we'll get a little bit more into it. But what I sent you all for the purpose of our discussion and study today was the first of these Congresses. The difference between a Pan-African Conference and the Pan-African Congresses is that the Congresses are continuous, right? The Congresses are continuous and generally have a unified theme to it in the sense that everyone involved is to some degree aware that this is not just to eradicate oppression, exploitation of African people, but to facilitate a fuller expression of Pan-Africanism, which is the liberation of the African continent. Okay? And that is probably most articulated or articulated at its height right before action in the Manchester Conference. Let me just pause 1 second. What we're doing here could be considered and should very likely be considered ideological development for you all to take some kind of action. Or so while you're taking action, you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? But then you have ideological development for larger bodies. We can look at the Congresses is a space where there is continuous ideological development. Okay, if that simplifies things, and actually, if that's more, that is probably a more accurate interpretation of what the Congresses would be. I'm going to read briefly what the how the Congresses come to express themselves and Du Bois's role. I normally, and I'm swapping out some of the readings that I've traditionally used. I use an essay by Du Bois about race, where he talks about his own genealogy and then identifies himself, what I call identifying or defining oneself in the context of time and space. However, I've switched that off, and I am going to send it to you all. It off with some excerpts from A World in Africa and The Souls of Black Folks, only because, there's more than one interpretation of Du Bois, and Du Bois largely, Du Bois, I think, initially had some issues around his identity. However, in light of Pan-Africanism in this context, he is committed to developing a think tank to facilitate, and he could only imagine himself, right? He could only imagine that at how it will culminate and how it would manifest, right? And he would end up, meaning he could only imagine that it will